So I'm going to try to give 15 minutes right now to go over the last week's theme, which is the psychology of political structures. And so I'm going to read Friday's article real quick, and then I'm going to dive into it and try to cover as much as I can. So Friday, I asked people to challenge the argument of political systems do not succeed because of their structure. They succeed because of the psychology of the people who defend them, and vice versa. They don't succeed because of the psychology as well. Most political discussion today treats systems as mechanical designs. Change the rules, change the incentives, and the outcome will change. But history suggests something far less comfortable. No political system survives on structure alone. A constitution, a monarchy, a democracy, a republic, none of these possess life in themselves. They are merely frameworks. The animating force is always the character of the men who operate within them. The Roman Republic endured not simply because of its institutions, but because generations of Romans possessed a psychological disposition toward duty, discipline, and civilizational continuity. The American Republic did not function in the 18th and early 19th centuries because of parchment barriers alone. It functioned because the political class and the population shared a broadly similar psychological foundation, a belief in restrained hierarchy and responsibility. When those psychological foundations dissolve, the structure becomes hollow. A republic governed by men who think like oligarchs become an oligarchy. A democracy governed by men who think like mobs becomes mob rule. A monarchy governed by weak men collapses into faction. The system reflects the mind of its advocates. Political systems are psychological mirrors. When the population becomes fragmented, resentful, or incapable of long-term thinking, the institutions inevitably mutate to reflect those traits. This raises the uncomfortable question of modern politics that if the character of the people determines the fate of their system, then institutional reform alone cannot solve civilizational decline. The deeper question becomes what kind of men must exist for a stable political order to survive? And then the argument, is the durability of a political system determined primarily by its institutional design, or is it determined by the psychology and character of the people who operate within it? I think it's an obvious answer that comes from this, which is that political systems are tools. As Jessica said in her response to this, there are no evil things, only evil people. So political systems are tools. They are not outcomes. They are things that we can use to reflect the will of a nation. And the political systems are always the state. The state is always the mechanism for which a nation represents itself in an administrative form, in some centralized capacity, administrative capacity, where we relinquish our rights to the extent that we extend rights into we extend a part of ourselves into a centralized state as a collective entity that manages the affairs for all of us. And if those affairs are not reflective of the will of the nation, if they are not a direct reflection of the people that are giving that to that state, then the state is not operating correctly. It is not functioning properly, and thus we have civilizational decline. The people make up the state, and the people form the state, and they reflect their will through the state. And so when the state does not do these things, properly reflecting the will of the people and made up of the people, then it is no longer their state. It is no longer their government. It is a foreign government. And so the psychology of the people who defend a foreign government versus the psychology of people who are defending a native government to themselves is very different. The former implies that people are slaves to that entity, that they are defending something that does not reflect their will. And the second one is, the latter is the one that is proper beneficent governance that does reflect the will of the people adequately and properly to the structure of those people. And so it's very obvious to me that it is the psychology of the people that dictates whether a political system is going to survive or whether it is going to emulate all of the other civilizations that have declined into nothingness or been taken over, conquered by foreign entities, and transmogrified into something else. And so we can either assume that if we just change from Republican to Democrats on the most superficial level of this conversation, oh, we're just going to change sides red to blue and then it's going to fix everything because the system's thinking that we're going to enter into this whole new ideal world just because we vote in these people that are a foreign government to us. They do not care about us. Fundamentally, we don't have time to get into all that now. By now, if you've been paying attention to Liberty Uncensored for a while, you should know already. But uh, there is no government for most Western nations these days. They're all foreign governments, and I would say for most of the world as well. But especially for Western nations, especially for white European nations, there is no government anymore that represents you. The will of the people is gone, and and we are facing that moment where we are going to have to take some kind of action, and it's different across the different nations depending on what their circumstances are, to correct that problem because the will of the people is not adequately reflected through their state. As such, the psychology of the people, the recognition process of this foreign control, um, the process of becoming aware of that is something that is happening now. Once that awareness grows to its pinnacle, then the action will take place, whatever that is, according to those people's will, as has always been the case across all civilizations. But how we can do that in the United States uh, is particular to the fact that the sovereign authority was given to the body of the people. It makes us quite different. And I talk about that in other places. So definitely go check out all of the articles on law if you haven't looked at them in Liberty Uncensored to catch up on how we can use the law to properly reflect the psychology of the people through our state. But bringing it back around and to quickly close this out, actually, so not even 8 minutes, maybe I'll end this in 10 minutes, is that to create a state in the first place requires homogeneity of a people. You can't create a state in a fractured environment where everybody has a different ideology, a political system that they endeavor to create. All you're going to create is factionalism that never cohesively comes together to create a operable entity reflecting the totality of the will of the people. It's just not possible. A nation has to be homogeneous. And so if you don't have that homogeneity, if you don't have that collective will, the unified will, the one will of the people to create the state that reflects that will and is properly able to administrate it, then you don't have a nation. A great example of this, and something I talked about on the podcast last night with Richard Grove, was that the USSR is a great example of this because in their federated territory during their existence, the minority populations were dominated. They weren't part of a de jure lawful state. They were dominated by that state and then included in that in a hodgepodge, sort of a melting pot in Russia, just like we have a melting pot in the United States since the early 1900s primarily. And before that a little bit, but primarily since the 1900s, since the influx of Jews came over to the United States and then began taking ownership of the media, and thus the natural evolution of that being that a lot of the Judaic ideas flowed into the legal system, into the philosophy, and into our culture, which made people push for civil rights, which actually was an extension of removing proper rights from the de jure man and woman. And so a political system is always going to reflect the will of the people. You can't get around that. If the will of the people is not being reflected through its political system, that will eventually move toward a revolution or some sort of change, however that may appear. And we are on the cusp of that in most Western nations and in some others around the world as well. But we are definitely right on the cusp of great manifesting change because the will of the people is quickly catching up and recognizing the fact that it is not being represented by their governments in any way, shape, or form. And now we know that these motherfuckers are eating babies. And I mean, a lot of us have known this all along. But Now everybody's catching up. Whether they do something about that or not, and this comes down to another point before I take off here, is that there's never been a revolution conducted because of the oppression of a people. A nation could be oppressed in every way, shape, and form. They won't revolt. They will continually accept their newfound boundaries, and even if they're clapped in irons, they'll accept it as long as they understand the boundaries, the rules, and the container that they are set within. They won't revolt. The moment that a revolution takes root is when there is a vision, a successful organization that parallels a government. You have to have authority in a parallel system, and it has to prove its authority by its actions over time. It also has to coincide with the fact that the people generally have a vision and hope for the future. They see something in which they can better their lives. If they don't have this motivation, if they don't have this insight into how their lives will be better, if they do conduct a revolution, break the old and enter into the new and the unknown, right? Going into the unknown is always more terrifying than to accept the fact that you're going to be oppressed by the known. And this is the general psychology of people, and it always has been. Although revolutions are relatively new amongst humanity in general. Before revolutions, there was revolts and there was other things, but revolution, um, in one sense, has always existed, and it's always existed in the sense that people who are oppressed don't rise up. People who are um, uh, in hope of the future, they see how it could be better, and they truly feel it, and they're seeing people doing it, and they're seeing the successes of it every day. Then a revolution is at hand. So carry the torch, be the hope and the vision for everybody else, and carry that forward indomitably, and be so so overtly free and responsible for your own life, and and vigilant in your life, that everybody around you that touches you becomes so as well. And that's where I'm going to leave it for tonight. 13 minutes. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming on. See you on Saturday.